Okay, seems to work. Your Royal Highnesses, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased and honored and delighted to be here today and being invited to present today's keynote talk. As has been said before, this is a very important meeting in very important times and very important themes. And as you might have noticed, I have changed the title of my talk a little bit from Change Yourselves and the System, not the Climate. And I hope that over the course of my presentation, it becomes clear why this is the case. Okay, so let's see. I think I've got around 2 hours for this talk. And let's see how far we are. No, I'm just kidding. Just a brief overview what you can expect. I will say some words about where we are when it comes to nature and the environment. I think most of you here in this room are very aware of the situation and that we need change. There are psychological levers, there are psychological parts in the system that we can focus on and that we focus on in our work that will be, that can be seen as leverages towards the transition. And one of these themes is certainly the role of collective agents. I mean, many of you might have experienced the feeling of, oh my God, I'm doing so much, but it doesn't really help because everybody else does not. And this is one of the very, very problematic things that we can overcome. And one specific part I will focus on, I mean, I could really talk for 2 hours or more, but I have around half an hour maybe, so I'll have to focus on some bits, and they will relate to social identity. I will get back to that, and then I will also present some work that we did in Landau. For those of you who do not know where Landau is, it's between Karlsruhe and France, so it's quite a small town in Germany, but very vibrant scientific community. So, apparently my headset also works now that I'm moving here. I'm using this graph very often. It is very simplified. It is very, very simple, but I think it's quite informative because it shows how unsustainable we as humans are. This is somewhat depressing because if you look, for example, into Germany or the United States, what this graph says is if every person on Earth would live like we do in Germany or like people in the US do, we would need 3 or 5 planets Earth to live sustainably. In other words, if everyone on Earth would live as the average US citizen, we would need as many resources, 5 times as many resources as the Earth is capable of producing. And apparently this is not sustainable. If you want a more scientific view on this, you've probably seen the climate stripes. They show over the last 150 years how the Earth gets warmer. You might have noticed red is never a good sign, so it's getting hotter the closer we come to the right side, around 2020. This is for the globe, and for Luxembourg, it doesn't look very different. There are probably some years where it's getting a bit colder again, but overall, this whole trend of it's getting warmer is very visible. Climate change itself is undisputed. We have a consensus of 99% among scientists worldwide that climate change is human-induced and that it's problematic. But still, we have a lot of people, a lot of governments who tell us different. For example, you might have heard in Germany, at least, I very often hear the argument, it might be similar in Luxembourg, oh, what can we as Germans do? We are only responsible for 2% of CO2 emissions. If you ever hear someone saying that, just show them this slide. These are the cumulative emissions over the last 250 years. And this is where Germany ranks on 4. Small country, few people, but when it comes to absolute cumulated CO2 emissions over the last 250 years, Germany ranks 4. Luxembourg should be somewhere further down. But what I want to say here is that we have, as industrial countries, we have an immense responsibility. And we cannot just look at emissions at this point. We have to look at emissions holistically over the course of history. The point I also want to make is, and this is also nothing new for you, climate is certainly probably one of the biggest problems we have, but not the only problem when it comes to our geophysical Earth system. Some of you might have seen this graph. It's based on the idea of the planetary boundaries by Johann Rockström and colleagues. The idea here is that we have basic geophysical processes, and we can operate within them in a certain secure space, which would be within the circle. But for many of these processes, we already passed this boundary up to a point where there may be no return, or where they will be tipping points that completely change the Earth system. This is besides climate change, this is something like this, EMSY, that's the genetic biodiversity of species. We have novel entities, just briefly introduced into the model. This is our plastic intake, for example, into nature, which is a huge problem. So one can, of course, ask, are we doomed? If I ask into this audience, if you want to raise your hand, are we doomed? Of course, no one will raise their hand because we're all optimistic that things will work out. I made a little survey, and with 2 participants, I have to be honest, my wife and myself, and we came to the conclusion that we are apparently all doomed. There might be some measurement error here with a no, but no, I'm just kidding. There's reason for optimism, but at the moment, we sort of sense, even in Central Europe, the consequences of climate change. We sit in Europe, we had one of the hottest years again, we had a very, very high, very dry conditions. Of course, there are still people saying it's only weather. Of course it's weather, but the weather patterns, they change over the years and it will get worse. So the question is, why is that the case? Why do we know what's going on, but why don't we act accordingly? Of course, there are various distractions probably. So when I think of climate emergency, but I still want to travel somewhere. I want to fly to New Zealand. I want to fly to Thailand or wherever. There's a lot of things that, that distract us from acting accordingly. And when we look at this, it is evident to most people that we need to change, that society needs to change. But still we have to deal with certain mindsets, with certain ways of thinking that work against this. For example, you might, even in your personal surroundings, you might have people who say, no, there is no climate crisis, that's all hysteric. You might have people who say, technology will save us, we just need to store carbon. We just need technology to save humanity. Then there are people who say, well, but it's policy and enterprises who are responsible. These are the levers we need to take. And then maybe you reach the point where you see, wow, I'm part of this whole system. Yes, and as part of this system, I can be part of the solution because I'm also part of the problem. So what we need to understand from my perspective is that this whole issue of acting against climate change and acting against global crisis in general is a complex interaction of ourselves, of our own individual selves, of the societies we are in, and of the surrounding policies and enterprises. And I'm trying to get you there, how psychology comes into play there. One reason why it is very, very difficult for us to change and to act is certainly that we are in a consumer society. This is true for most of the rich countries in the world. So we want to do something for the climate, but somehow we can't because we earn money that we want to spend. We have certain social norms that we have to follow. If you have children, you probably know that Christmas is coming soon, and you don't want your child to say something, but my friend, he gets much more Lego than I do. So we have certain norms in our society that make it very, very difficult to act pro-environmentally. And this is not per se our individual fault. I'll have a little anecdote. Maybe some of you know the product Listerine. Is that known to some of you? It's a mouthwash that you can use to have a good breath. Before Listerine was a mouthwash, it was a toilet cleaner. Why am I telling this? Because it nicely shows how marketing from enterprises built up needs that we didn't have before. And they did this with really an amazing, it was in the 30s or 40s, I think, with an amazing marketing campaign. Often a bridesmaid, never a bride. As long as you have bad breath, you will never get the man of your life. And with this marketing campaign, they introduced Listerine as a mouthwash. And this is not the only example. Most of you certainly have a smartphone in their pocket. Until 2007, when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, I think most of us did not have the need to have internet with us all of the time. So what we need to understand is that we are in a consumer society, we are in a society where a lot of groups motivate us to consume and to buy, and that makes it very, very difficult to act. So, but where do we hook in? Yeah, we as psychologists, we often focus on individual attitudes, on individual values, but we also try to understand how we function, how we work in our social environment. And the next slide, it looks a bit weird, but I'll get you through this in a second. This is one of those models that tries to explain society. It looks very complicated. In fact, it's not. It's from colleagues, from Giels and Schott, and they argued that we need to understand society as a multi-level society where we have something like, just come over here, we have something like a socio-technological landscape. Yeah, this is the broad picture around us. This is climate conditions, resource availabilities, and so on. Then we have the socio-technological regime. Yeah, this is market preferences, industries, the policies we make, the science, the culture, and so on. And then we have the niche innovations. This is this part of society where we as psychologists, and I think we as actors, can hook in, because according to the model, these are small networks of actors who have novel ideas, who want to bring something into society, and these ideas, if shared by many and if brought forward by many, can actually feed into this socio-technological regime. So by acting, by having small networks, by having innovation and so on, we can change the policy, the culture, the societal norms that bring forward society. And eventually, this socio-technological change can then also change the whole landscape. And how does psychology get in there? I think this is the important point. How can we use sorry to skip back. How can we use psychological knowledge to really bring forward such niche innovations? As I said, there's a lot to say about this, and I will focus on some points here. I think one that often comes into mind when we think about psychology and how we all act, people think about values, beliefs. Yeah, something like people with universalist values. They are people who are for equality, for justice, and for the environment. So is this something where we need to get? And apparently, this is certainly one point. I'll get to that more in a minute. We need effective leadership. Effective leadership, this is, in fact, policy and policy making who make decisions that can help citizens acting accordingly. Yeah? When you're in Germany, car country, most of you know certainly, and you want to do something different about your mobility, but you have a policy that primarily focuses on individual car mobility, you have a very, very hard time seeing this as effective leadership of policy if you want change of your mobility. Then collective action and increased agency. I will get to this also in a minute. Shift in social norms and change of narratives. These are 5 psychologically relevant aspects that we need to take into account. I'll get through them step by step. Most of you are probably aware of Boromir from The Lord of the Rings, and he says this wonderful sentence: "One does not walk simply into Mordor." And also, one does not simply walk into Primark. Yeah, this is the value shift we need. We need to understand that we need to change our consumption patterns completely. Yeah, without being moral. Yeah, without going to tell people, "Oh, you bought a non-vegetarian burger. How bad are you?" We should not do this. It's all individual decisions, but we need environmental awareness. We need nature awareness. This alone, as I will tell also in the following, this alone will not help. We know from a lot of studies in Germany and Europe and worldwide that people have a relatively strong environmental awareness that environment, nature is important to them, but still this is not enough to shift behavior. So we need a change in our values. So we have to move away from these short-sighted satisfaction of needs in a way to long-term satisfaction of human well-being, of human agency, of human of human social togetherness. The second is effective leadership. That's what I just said. Yeah, we need effective leaders. We need effective policies. We need policies that take climate seriously, and we need policies that make policies in a way that we, as citizens, can act pro-environmental. Yeah, I'm very often told not very often, but I've been told by some activist people, no, we don't need to wait for politics, we can do it on our own. Of course, we can and we need to do it on our own, but the big levers, the big levers that can reach a lot, they are made in politics, yeah? And we need politics that make it easier for us to change our behaviors. Same with efficacy. Yeah, the feeling of efficacy, the feeling of self-efficacy, the feeling that I as Gerhard or I as a person want to change something with my behavior. This can only be frustrated when it comes to climate crisis, because I've been vegetarian now for 20 years, but I can't see any consequence of this. I don't see less meat consumed, I don't see less land systems transformed to feed animals. So my self-efficacy here is very, very low. What we need is a mental transformation in a way that people understand, okay, I as an individual, I can, and I do contribute to a collective. I contribute with my behavior to a collective goal. So we need to motivate the feeling of collective efficacy, the feeling that we as a group, we as a nation, we as a community can really make a change. And this can motivate people much more than this individual, oh, now you bought a cucumber without plastic. Congratulations. The fourth point is about social norms. Yeah, social norms is something that influences us all our lives. Social norms differ from culture to culture, but social norms are very, very effective. If I would stand here now and look up there for about 5 minutes, maybe 10 seconds, a lot of you would also join looking up. Yeah? When you walk through Luxembourg City and you walk around and you look up like this, people you have never met before will certainly look up. And the more people look up, the more others will follow and look up. These are social norms. Yeah? When you go into a train, when you're at a train station, the train arrives, you enter the train after people left the train. Yeah, you would not enter that. Some people do, and they usually get punched in the face. But you enter. You have rules. We have rules. We have societal rules, and these are norms. And we have to use these norms, or we have to build norms in a way that are effective for climate action. And of course, this is very difficult because we have societal norms that until now work against climate action. I was just talking about the Christmas situation, usually when it comes to buying presents that after Christmas stand around and are just going to be rubbish. But what we need is a societal shift, a shift to norms that make it obvious, that make it a standard that climate protective behavior is the standard. Well, that was tautological. Anyway, but this, of course, is not simple. We have a lot of policies, a lot of debate, a lot of media debate in the last 20 years has focused on something like the individual carbon footprint. I'm sure many of you have used one of these footprint calculators to enter or to figure out how big your footprint is. This is good. It's informative, it's good to know, and when you live in a country like Germany or Luxembourg, you can also test this and put a 0 everywhere, and you still have a CO2 footprint of 6 to 7 tons, which is about 3 times as much as we are as we should have. So the thing is, with this individual perspective, we are coming to certain borders. We need systemic solutions. Meanwhile, there are, of course, certain groups that have no interest on systemic solutions. BP, British Petroleum, some of you might know, is one of the main agents, one of the main public and enterprise agents who were funding campaigns to make this individual footprint popular. Yeah? Why? Maybe because a focus on what an individual can do, on how much I can do to protect the environment, may distract from systemic solutions that we need. And something like the fossil fuel industry is probably not interested in systemic solutions at this point. So what we need is, what we need is a change in the way we also speak about things, a change in narratives, a change in how we talk about certain topics and themes. So this is also maybe visible in the discussion. I'm not sure how it is conducted in Luxembourg, but in Germany there's a lot of discussions about how this can be in a just way. So there are then ideas like CO2 taxes or CO2 certificates, and maybe from time to time also ideas about bans, Verbote, prohibitions, banning certain behaviors. But this is very, very uncool in most settings to talk about bans, because we're all living in individual freedom. But there's a lot of reason to assume that when it comes to climate and nature protection, some bans may be inevitable. And at this moment, I believe we still have options to actively shape these regulations that we need. But in some years that might be too late, and we need harsh restrictions. And there's various examples. For example, if you remember, some of you might remember that we had the opportunity to smoke in bars and restaurants until some years ago. And then there was the discussion about banning this. And a lot of people said, oh, should we do this? Don't you think the restaurants will die? No one's coming anymore. But no, the opposite happened. People with children went back into pubs. People with children went back into restaurants where people smoked before. And there was no big dying of bars and restaurants and so on. So what I want to say here is, if certain bans, if certain prohibitions are communicated in a way that they make sense, and communicated in a way that people say, yeah, that might really be useful, this may be one path. However, this is also a matter of justice. Yeah, when we look at the main contributors to CO2 emissions, these are unfortunately the upper 5 to 10% of the global population, including ourselves here. So a lot of people from these groups, they are reluctant to speak for bans. Why? Because they would probably be affected the most. In Germany, there was a discussion about banning inland flights, flying from Berlin to Munich or from Stuttgart to Hamburg. The interesting thing here is that around 3% of Germans use inland flights, but around 50% of Germans are against banning them. So what we have here is like a very, very, starkly rooted fear of banning things, even if I'm not even affected. And I think these are the narratives that we sort of need to change. All of the things that I've been talking about until now, I haven't invented them myself. Of course, research is always a collaboration of a lot of people. But what I just talked about, this very nicely resonates with some of the findings that we got from an expert interview study we conducted 2 years ago. Josephine Tröger, she was a PhD student at that time. With her, we asked 21 experts from science, from politics, from enterprises about what are the barriers to climate action and to sufficient behavior, to consuming less, and what are probably the visions or the catalysts. And it's basically exactly what I was talking about. Yeah? We have economic norms that hinder us acting accordingly. We have infrastructures. Yeah? If I have roads everywhere, people want to go by car, of course. We have capacities and path dependencies. So, for example, we can see this nicely in Germany at the moment, in Berlin, where there's an Autobahn going to be built that has been planned 20 years ago, and we are on this path, and it is very, very difficult to change such a path once decisions are made. And which I also said, the focus on individuals is problematic. Yeah, if we only focus on individuals, we shift the responsibility to individual people, but we need shifts on a systemic, on a political level. And and one thing, I cannot go into detail with all of these things, but one part that is particularly relevant for psychologists, I believe, is that one catalyst or one help would be a focus on groups and communities, on alliances, on people that work together so that we can sort of harvest collective efficacy beliefs and motivate people through these collective efficacy beliefs. This again brings us here. Yeah. this is what we need. We need these niche innovations. We need individuals with certain similar mindsets that come together, that bring their knowledge together, their ideas, and bring this into the socio-technical regime. One example how this worked is probably Fridays for Future, the Fridays for Future movement. This is exactly what happened here. And after a while, it moved the whole debate. It moved the whole media attention and also political attention. We all had that then here in this socio-technological regime. So there is a lot of hope that getting along or getting together with people, with like-minded people with similar mindsets, as in the Climate Alliance, for example, that this can really bring important change on medium levels. How can this work psychologically? Just another model. I'm going to be very brief here. This is one that we formulated where we argue that identification with a certain group, feeling a bond to a certain group, feeling a bond to a community, can be very motivating. And this combined with feelings that we as a community, we as a group, we as the Climate Alliance, we can really make a change, that this can motivate us very, very starkly and motivate us even in a way that we act pro-environmentally, even in our private fields. And important here is that all these psychological effects that we look at, they all, of course, interact with the systemic surroundings, with the society that is around us. And I will just present some empirical work here, and I'm quite hopeful that the moderation will tell me once I have to be finished. So still a lot of time. Okay, cool. So maybe just some words. As a scientist, we're always on the edge of, on the one hand, presenting theoretical and empirical work in a way that it is correct, but on the other hand, also in a way that it can be digested. So if there's one graph or some numbers that is that appears complicated, just ignore it. I'll try to get us through there. So one point, just to get back here, one point I just made is that identifying with certain groups, with certain movements, with certain people is one key to understanding why people act pro-environmentally. And in the following, I will show some work that shows the interactions and then go onto one specific identity that I think might be quite useful here. Dietary shift. Yeah, most of you know that the way we eat in many of the rich countries is problematic. We eat too much meat. That's not only bad for health, but also bad for the environment, because meat consumption is using a lot of land systems. And so reducing global meat consumption would be like one of the two strongest individual behaviors that you could do. You could just say today, okay, I'm becoming a plant-based eater from next week, and you don't need any policy for this. You don't need more money for this. The only thing you need is, to get over your own, habits and your own feelings of hedonistic values. So what we did here in this study, what we wanted to look at is how do these individual psychological variables, how do they feed into something like, how can this be combined with how the land system changes or how climate is changing? Yeah, because where can this be in such a model? And what we try to do together with people from the International Institute of Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, close to Vienna, we build a conceptual framework where we try to look how climate events, how they are affected by certain geophysical aspects that are in this Felix model. I'm not going into detail here. But most importantly, we wanted to see how certain individual views, feelings of efficacy, feelings or attitudes towards the environment, feelings of normative behavior, what is normative, how this feeds into such a model, and whether this can also affect climate events and land system change. So this is the conceptual model, and please don't ask me about details, what exactly the model did. That was what the colleagues from the IASA Institute did. But what we find in the end is when we look at the most important predictors of a shift in diet, we find exactly what we would predict from psychology, namely that social norms are important, what people around me do. This is apparently one of the most important predictors of becoming a plant plant-based eater. So when a lot of people around me eat plant-based, I'm very much motivated to do so as well. And feelings of efficacy. So if I have the impression that with my change in diet, I can contribute to a global diet shift, this is also apparently very motivating. A similar, or in another setting, we wanted to show how these systemic interactions, these systemic institutions affect our individual behavior. And what we did here also with a PhD student, Karen Hamann from Landau, now at the University of Leipzig, she conducted a study where she assessed various non-psychological variables of an institution at this point of a university, like the university size, university policies, does the university have a green office or something like this, and then test whether these structural variables have an effect on individual level variables, such as how capable do I feel to change something? How do I identify with a certain group? And what we find here, also just briefly, is that there are correlations or relations between the university landscape. So the smaller a university, the more capable do people feel to do something for the environment, for the climate at the university. The more or if there's a green office, like a sustainability office in the university, this is also motivating people on an individual level. This is motivating people to be more active, to be more pro-environmental. Yeah, and the key message of this slide is we can change our institutions, we can change the way we have policies, and this will affect individuals. Yeah, as Gerhard, I very often think, oh, I feel relatively environmental conscious, yeah, but still, I'm of course strongly affected by my surroundings. I'm strongly affected by the institutions which I'm in, and even as a scientist, if you want to go to conferences which are on the other side of the planet, you can either not go to the conference or go to the conference taking a plane, which is of course highly problematic. So, very simplified, the point I want to make: the way we act is a function not only of our brain, it's not only a function of what we think, what we believe, but it's a function of the societal regime and the landscape of what is around us. And I'm coming to an end in about 5 minutes. Would that work? Cool. The point I want to make here, and this is like a short course in social psychology. There's a theory in social psychology, it's called the social identity theory, which says that we as persons, we have some sort of identity, and this identity is based on idiosyncratic values. That means very, very individual personality parts. Yeah, so I'm Gerhard, and this is good as it is. But I'm also a father. I'm also a professor. I'm also a psychologist. I'm also male. I'm also a German, and so on and so on. So everyone in this room has not just a very personal identity, but an identity that is fueled by membership to certain groups. And these group memberships, that they are so important for ourselves. I mean, we're social beings as humans, yeah? We like to connect with other people. And these social groups, they're so important, and in a way that up to a point when we strongly identify with a certain group, we sort of fuse with this group and want that the group feels well, that everything in the group is going well. So if I identify strongly as, for example, if I identify strongly as a Greenpeace member or as a Climate Alliance member, I'm very, very interested in that the whole group works and that everyone in this group is feeling good. This is one of the basic ideas of the social identity theory. So the more I identify on a group level, the more this group is important to me, the more I want to act in service of this group. And this is something that we can use. When it comes to the climate crisis, there's a lot of debate on how this can be achieved, like what groups may be relevant. And one idea that I want to bring forward briefly is that something like global concern, that acting for a global cause against the climate crisis might be rooted in an identity that encompasses probably all humans. So this is what we call a global identity. A global identity is identification with all humans. This sounds probably to some a bit esoteric. Yeah, how can I identify with a whole group of humanity? 8 billion people. How can I even think about identifying with this group? It seems to work. it's social identity on the highest level of human inclusion. And as I said, if I identify highly on this global level, I should be concerned about all humanity. I should be concerned about what's going on with people very, very distant from myself. And apparently, or evidently, this includes environmental behavior. So when I have a strong identification on this human level, I should be motivated to act accordingly. And there is, I can jump over this is just conceptual, there is research suggesting this. It does not mean, this global identity, I just say it right here, it does not mean that I cannot identify as a Luxembourger or as a German or as a Thuringian or whatever, but it can be one path towards conservation behavior, towards action, namely by assuring that, or by making clear that we are all one human family, and therefore all humans should have the same rights and should have the same basic rights and basic duties. And this can motivate myself to step into for more transnational efforts. And just to show you that this is not just a concept, there's a lot of work out there by now showing exactly this. Last year we published an article where we looked at whether this global identity is relating to pro-environmental action when it comes to mobility. And what we found here is that, for example, the more strongly people identify on a global level, the more willing they are to refrain from flight travel. The more strongly people identify on a global level, the more flight shame they experience, the more willing they are to compensate, and the more or the stronger train prices they would accept to go somewhere by train, for example. We find similar relations when it comes to consumer behavior. Some years ago, we conducted a study on chocolate consumption as a nice example. Here, participants in a laboratory were asked about their global identity and so on. In the end, they could choose a chocolate bar. This was either a fair trade organic chocolate bar or a conventional chocolate bar. They were matched when it comes to taste. So it was not that the fair trade was quinoa avocado chocolate and the other one just milk. It was all matched. And what we find here is that the stronger one's global identity, the more likely to choose the fair chocolate bar, even if it's just half the size for myself. So it seems to make a feeling of global identity seems to make people more extend their moral cycle beyond themselves and maybe beyond others. Of course, you could say, these were just probably psychology students. We find the same relationships in worldwide representative samples, such as the World Value Survey. The more you identify on a global scale, the more likely it is that you're active in an environmental NGO, the more willing you are, the higher your willingness to pay higher taxes, and the more willing you are to donate or go to demonstrations. It's the same with clothing consumptions, where we find that a higher global identity can relate to the intention to consume less clothing. We find this in other contexts as well. Just briefly, the more you identify on a global scale, the more you think that climate change is relevant, and the more, as a consequence, the more willing you are to change your behavior. This is also visible in real-life communication. Twitter, some of you might use Twitter. We checked here whether this hashtag global citizen is used widely and what happens with these. And when you look at tweets that have a global citizen hashtag included, it's very often tweets that are based or that relate to nature protection, climate change, global justice, and so on and so on. And as maybe one of the last bits, I'm very often asked, okay, if global identity is such a good idea, is it really? How can we increase, or how can people experience global identity? There's some research looking at this, for example, by one of my co-workers, and she argued that being mindful, for example, can help building up such a connection to humanity. And what we did here, we asked practitioners and non-practitioners of meditation and mind-body practices, and found out that people who do this mind-body practice, they identify more on a global scale, and this identification in turn predicts pro-environmental behavior and climate policy support. We also did this with a randomized controlled trial, like with an experiment, where we had people use an app over the course of 7 days, where they could actively do this mind-body practice. And also here, we found that people who did this meditation course identified stronger on a global scale, which in turn predicted pro-environmental behavior. So to sum this briefly up, there was a lot of input maybe in this Oh, 39 minutes, I'm sorry. Maybe the most important part is probably this one here, that we need to understand psychological processes, the way we act, the way we behave, as functions of and interactions with the systemic and structural conditions. I've shown some psychological processes that we could really use and address here. But for the moment, I think it's clear that we need everyone. Yeah, have you seen that movie? You know how he says everyone. It's great. We need everyone to act. And I think at this point, I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Stay up with me because we're allowing some questions. So you might have the opportunity to add a little bit. Thank you very much, Gerhard, for this presentation and indeed a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much, and I was happy to give you the 39.5 minutes. That's okay.
Thank you.
We do have a bit of time for questions, particularly maybe at this point questions of clarification. We'll have a panel after the coffee break to have even more discussion about all these issues. But I'd be inviting questions and comments from the floor here in the room, as well as online. Sarah is watching the chat, so don't be shy. If you have a question or you'd like to make a comment, you'd like him to explain a little further one or two of the things that Gerhard has been discussing, then you have an opportunity to do that now. You could raise your hand and somebody will come to you with a microphone. Jan, the gentleman in the front. If you say your name and your organization, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Robert Leven. I'm from here. A short question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. We are much talking today about bubble thinking, also in social media and so on. What do you think is the best way to break up the bubbles, but not the one behind you? Watch out, please.
Yeah, we already had 2 bubbles breaking. Thank you for this question. I think there's, from my perspective, 2 answers. Answer 1 is communication. Trying to bring these bubbles together. It's not necessary that they meet in a pub and just have a drink, but that might help. Yeah, if you have people from different bubbles, just bring parts of these bubbles together and have them discuss. And this can particularly help when it's institutionally organized and based on respect and what's the other English word? Wertschätzung, respect. I think.
Appreciation.
Appreciation. Thank you. That's very appreciative. Thank you. And I think this is the important thing, that these bubbles communicate again with each other. It does not work on Twitter. It does not work on Facebook. If you're using these social media things, you see there's a lot of between bubble clash. You can't really talk to each other. I think this is a very, very time-consuming process, and I think it requires face-to-face discussions between people.
Thank you. Thanks. There's another question. I think that is Max right in the middle. And sorry.
Thank you very much. I think it's for me it was really an interesting presentation because I think I have read some sociologists like Don Beck who really believes that you have 8 or 10% dedicated people in a society who really want something. They are able to influence the whole society because you have this belly, which in the middle of society, which then follows the trend, and I think you have a good point there. One thing which you didn't mention at all, which is radical, pacific, ecological protest, blocking roads, blocking power plants, blocking railways. What is that something which helps, or is that something which creates so much divide in society that it slows down things? Because sometimes I think we need to speed up things, and sometimes we need to get to a point to show that things cannot continue like that. So what is the role of these groups?
Yeah, that's probably one of the $1 million questions. Again, very often, we as psychologists, we very often say it depends, and it's unfortunately true. In this case, these, as you said, radical movements, last generation in Germany, for example. I fear that in the public, they are seen as more disruptive and seen as not on the point, primarily, of course, because in the media, we only talk about how annoying they are. I think if certain journalists, certain media, they really work on why they do it and why it is necessary to have this attention, I think there would be more acceptance among the public. When it comes to movements such as Fridays for Future or even Extinction Rebellion, there's much more acceptance in the public, and it even brought people on the streets who were not on the streets before. This whole Friday for Future movement, it resulted in other groups forming, such as the Grandparents for Future, Economists for Future, Farmers for Future, and so on and so on. So there seems to be a certain, a certain window of radicalization or a certain window of assertiveness that can be very motivating. But whether you see this as motivating or as just an annoyance, I think that also depends on your political and ideological views.
Thank you. I think I saw Max here in the middle, and then there is a question from the online community, and there's another one.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm Max, working for Climate Alliance. I was wondering, you were mentioning, right, like these kind of social norm changes take time, and obviously we've looked, when you look at the past, for example, the abolitionist movement, obviously that took a very long time to kind of really change society. But with climate change, you were asking the question, we are doomed. We have a specific time scale where we need to change, right? Let's say 2050. Let's take 2050. Is there any research being done that compares these societal changes and how long they took, comparing to the time we have today, and what were the results if they took place?
Yeah, I'm not a historian, but there are changes and disruptive changes to society that were relatively quick. For example, with the internet, that started out in the late 90s and changed the way we live, the way we consume, the way we communicate completely within a very, very brief amount of time. Very similarly, there's a nice picture from New York in the 1910s, where you have one picture, people walking around New York and stuff, and 5 to 10 years later, people just driving around in cars. Why? Because Henry Ford made this mass production of cars and made cars available and cheap and so on. So there are examples where societies can change drastically within a few years, but I don't think this can be predicted. When it comes to a socio-ecological transformation, I fear that there won't be a single event that brings us to us. There were some people arguing, oh, the corona pandemic, it dropped CO2 emissions, people become more solidary with each other and so on. That lasted for about a couple of months, and then it all changed completely. I think we need a transformation, a quick transformation, but this can only work if we have effective and powerful and mutig, brave leadership together with people who are willing to change. I think we have a majority of people willing to change in many, many industrial countries worldwide, but at the moment we don't have the policymakers who do justice to this.
Thank you. Now I'm looking at the clock. We have 4 more minutes for this question of clarification. I'll go to Sarah because online participants have been active, and if there is time, I would go to you. Otherwise, we do it after the coffee break, okay? Sarah.
Yeah, just quickly, we have a question from Anna Höhne about concrete insights about actively increasing global identity in a community. So how would one go about that? And is there any best practice, good examples, maybe even publications that we can send around later?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is. But maybe just one step back, this idea of global identity that I presented, there's a lot of criticism on this as well. I don't know if we need to discuss about this, but even in science, there's a lot of debate about what it actually is, what we measure there with the global identity. So this is maybe one disclaimer before I answer the question. But if we assume that global identity can be one, not the only one, not the most important one, but can be one psychological mindset or path towards change, there's some research indicating that international contact helps raising this global identity. So if you have in your childhood, if in your childhood you had a lot of contact with people from other countries, it increases the likelihood that you feel this sense of global community. If you have contact, even we conducted studies where we showed that even a computer-mediated contact with someone from another continent can, for a moment, raise your global identity, or the idea that we are all more similar than different, probably. And another set of research shows that, yeah, having the impression that people are respectful to me can also relate to this feeling of global identity. So there is some research. It's all it's all very scientific laboratory research, which needs to be shown whether it works in real life. But then there are, of course, also institutions who work with this idea. The Melton Foundation might be probably some of you heard of it. It deals specifically with the idea of a global citizen, and that we should build global citizenship and through education and so on. So there are paths, but whether they really work under real life conditions, this needs to be tested.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gerhard, and thank you all for these very interesting questions, and thank you for being so able to respond on the spot as well. I hope it's okay to postpone your questions